Okay, so we'll just give it another minute while we wait for people to join us. Welcome to everyone who's here already on this gorgeous sunny day. Feels good to finally have some sunshine, doesn't it? Yes. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you're all well, and thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the discussion we're going to be having on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Kirsten Samuel, the CEO of Camwell, and I am going to be moderating what is set to be a very topical and timely conversation today. I use the words topical and timely because we're having this conversation at a time when DEI is facing some significant challenges. Over the past year, we've seen a lot of progress in making workplaces more inclusive, in holding organisations more accountable, in bringing conversations about equity to the forefront. But more recently, we've also started to see some pushbacks where DEI budgets have been cut, commitments have been questioned, and in some places, the conversation is becoming very politicised. It was only January this year that President Trump signed an executive order eliminating DEI initiatives within the federal government, describing DEI efforts as illegal and immoral discrimination programs and a public waste. And I think it's fair to say that the ripple effect of that is definitely being felt very worldwide. So today we're going to be exploring where DEI stands in 2025 and how organisations can continue to embed it in a way that isn't just performative, but it's also sustainable, strategic, and ultimately making an impact. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by three experts who I've known for a long time. And they're not just going to be talking about DEI, but they are also all actively working really hard to drive meaningful change in their organisations. So firstly, we've got the wonderful Jo Portlock. I've known Jo Portlock for a number of times. For a number of years, we've worked with her organisation for the last 10. Jo is the VP of Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And there she leads on the global D&I strategy, unconscious bias and conscious inclusion education, diverse talent sponsorship programs, and psychological safety initiatives. She also runs a global network of 25 ERGs, as well as overseeing well-being, early careers, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability efforts. Jo's worked in HR across major organisations for over 20 years, and she's a really passionate advocate for neurodiversity, being neurodiverse herself, as well as being a passionate advocate for inclusion and accessibility for neurodiverse and disabled people. Welcome, Jo. I feel absolutely exhausted just going through that incredible list of things that you do. I don't know where you find the time to do that all. And then we have Artie Kashyap-Ainsley. Artie is the Global Head of Wellbeing and Inclusion at Ocado Group, and she leads on the cross-functional strategies that integrate wellbeing, DEI and ESG, creating impact at both cultural and operational levels. Artie's got over 15 years professional services experience. In fact, I first met Artie when she was leading on wellbeing at Deloitte. And she also serves as an advisor and non-exec director to a number of different organisations, as well as being a certified life coach. Welcome, Artie. And finally, Sunaina. So Sunaina is a global DEI strategist and founder of an incredible company called The Human Difference. And she brings with her over 15 years of in-house leadership and consultancy expertise. She has a multi-industry background, a multi-sector background, and Sunaina designs strategies that build inclusive cultures, that power business success and create meaningful social and economic impact. If you're interested in DEI, you want to find out how to do it differently to create that lasting change, then I really recommend looking Sunaina up and organising a coffee with her afterwards. So enough of me talking, let's dive into some questions. I think it would be great to start off looking at the current DEI landscape. But I think just firstly, in the last few years, we've seen such a whole host of acronyms around DEI. We started at diversity and inclusion, then we moved to EDI, then we moved to DEI, now we're DEIB. I'd just love to know what you guys are calling it. And is there any right or wrong answer with this? Jo, what are your thoughts? Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so I think firstly, when I started, we just called it DEI, right? And we stayed pretty true to that. Just really calling it what it is seemed to work best for us. And we talked about I&D and stuff, but actually what we know we needed to do is attract the most people, and DEI seemed to just explain it better. Of course, I've seen so many changes, and I think now is the time to actually really come back to what fundamentally is DEI or DEI, DIB or DEIB. And I think what's really important is we continue to engage the broadest audience. I think in reality, DEI has got its detractor element, which is really sad to see, because I think when you fundamentally break it down, it's diversity is just broad perspective, equity is just fairness, and inclusion is just bringing everybody together. What I can share for us as a business is we are probably more likely to lean into inclusion and belonging. We've talked about the FAIR acronym, which stands for fair, accessible, inclusive, and representative, which I think we will start to lean on a little bit more. And I think given the broad dialogue, what's going to be really important is choosing words and descriptions it is very hard to argue against. That's why I like fairness. How could anybody say they don't want to live in a fair world? Whatever your views, political persuasions, your background, your lived experiences. And I think that's where I would see that naming and dialogue going more. Why, let's just use inclusive terms, or the most inclusive terms that bring everybody together.
Yeah. Thank you. That seems very reasonable, Jo. Artie, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I echo very similarly what Jo was saying also. I think when I joined Ocado and we were starting to look at it, it was never consistent. It was like, in some things we do, it'd say inclusion, then it would say diversity and inclusion, then diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think only in the last 12 months where we're like, can we just like land on a consistency in terms of what we're actually going to call it internally? But similar to Jo, I think at the heart of everything that we do, fairness is probably at the core of it. And it's fairness mixed with this idea of having the best talent possible to make to allow the organization to thrive, and making sure that at the heart of it is that fairness, that we're giving everyone that equal opportunity to come to the table and be part of our organization. But equally, we want to make sure that the opportunities are wide enough that we're casting that net and we are getting all the best talent that we can. So I think it really is about that. I think there's also an element of just really being able to understand, because everything links to us, to people employee experience. And so there's understanding this view of like, how can I really understand my workforce by really understanding the permutations that make them up as an individual. And that does take account into the diversity or demographics of what makes up an individual. But equally, it's about us being able to layer that against experience and like overall day-to-day what they're facing into, so that we can create an environment that really enables all of our employees to thrive.
Yeah. Thank you, Artie. And, just for people that are fairly new to any of these acronyms, whatever they are, how would you distinguish? They're quite nuanced, aren't they? So how would you, in the most simplest, layest terms, distinguish between diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? I think that'd be really useful.
Sure. Jo actually touched on it. So just to complement what Jo said, to me, diversity is who's in the room, right? Inclusion is about who gets to speak. Equity is about meeting people where they are. So who gets what they need to thrive. And belonging to me is the output. It's the emotional experience of this work all coming together, of having that inclusive culture. And Artie said it's about building the environments where everyone can thrive.
Yeah.
In the work that I don't mind what you call it, my clients call it all sorts of different things. To me, what's important is the work gets done, and it's systemic change, not just performative sort of overlay. And I think what's also really important is that the way I approach this is to start with inclusion, because I firmly believe if we look at how wonderfully diverse our world is, you have diversity in your organizations, but do they feel safe enough to bring their best selves forward and do their best work? Potentially not. And yes, you can attract the best talent. Will they stay if the culture isn't right, if they don't feel the inclusion and the belonging that you're trying to create there? Call it what you wish, but we just need to get the work done.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's such a huge amount going on in the world right now, particularly in the US, post Trump's executive order to eliminate DEI initiatives within federal government. How is that being felt and impacting us in the UK at the moment?
I
Jo-
heard that. Sorry, I
yeah.
was going to just jump in. I feel like I'm not going to say it, but somebody said something like, when the US coughs, the UK sniffs. It's almost like this like lead on effect, and probably not giving it justice in terms of the phrase at all. But I think it's definitely all organizations, irrespective of what they're US run or UK run or globally, are having like all the US stuff is having an impact, in the sense of like everyone needs to kind of step back and have a look at and either reconfirm their commitments or take a stake on, do we need to review what's going to happen? It's only a matter of time before there is a trickle down effect. And it's just being really clear on two things. One, what's the organizational stance? And if they need to pivot, how are they going to pivot, and what does that look like? And we're seeing that obviously we're a UK FTSE listed organization, but we're equally having to lean into the conversations and the considerations around, I think Joe alluded to at the beginning, it's ultimately what are we trying to do? And then what, as a result of that, does that mean in terms of the terminology that we use or the actions that we take, and what's the messaging that we send to the business? As of right now, our commitments are firm, but we equally have to think about what that landscape and how that landscape shifts, especially from a business lens perspective. We have to have that maintain that view.
What about you, Joe? Would you say, how obviously LexisNexis Risk Solutions is a very large and significant global organisation. Is there anything that you would add on to what Artie said in terms of the impact what's going on in the US is having on risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's twofold in terms of impact. I think within the UK, yes, it's impacting our work, it's impacting the dialogue, of course, but I also feel we're not living it right. So I'm very mindful, particularly of our LGBTQ colleagues, our Black and Hispanic colleagues, who I think at the moment are actually quite scared. I think we have to acknowledge that, irrespective of our political views. We're a company where we want everybody to belong, and we have to look out for each other. And I think, therefore, that is also trickling into those communities, not exclusively, because the great thing is everybody cares about this work, but people will remember how we've treated and how we made people feel. So I think that's something we're all mindful of, right? You can't section off the US in a global company. We're all talking, we're all interacting, we're all benefiting from inclusion, our different thoughts and perspectives, and so many companies operate globally. I think in terms of practicalities, yes, it's definitely part of the dialogue, and it's definitely coming through. And I think there is more conversation about, can you show the ROI on D&I? Can you demonstrate the impact? I always say, if you look at the world, the case for D&I has never been stronger, right? There are nearly 50% of America are not white or from an ethnically representative background. If you look at Gen Z, their mental health, 20% of Gen Z at least would identify as LGBTQ+, higher diagnosis of neurodiversity. We're going to work longer, sadly. There's going to be more age diversity. There's more disability diversity in the workplace. We're all working more globally. So actually, there has never been a stronger case for D&I. I think it's just for us to lead through and continue to make the case for the huge impact we have within culture, because the need is not changing, right? It's getting stronger. I just think some dialogue is detracting from it.
So how do organisations keep driving this agenda then without getting caught in the supposed culture wars?
I think it's being less performative, right? So I think this is an opportunity to really course correct if that has been your pathway. I think organizations need to get behind this agenda in a very different way. So investment, resourcing. I quite support the idea of DEI reporting straight into the CEO, because I think accountability was a key piece of what's been missing to date. It has to be systemic. It has to be embedded into every function, practice and process of an organization, just like any other business critical agenda. So I think when you look at it in that light, it's a terrifying time for the US, but it's also a really important defining moment for DEI. The narrative in the US it's politically charged. So that tells me DEI is not what's wrong, it's how it's being misinterpreted by a political agenda. And Joe, to your point about Gen Z, EduBuddy are a US-based organization. They did a survey of Gen Z, They are the most diverse generation to enter the workforce, right? So to your point, I think you said 25% LGBTQ plus. They're 48% non-white. They're 53% neurodiverse. And they're 46% of them are actively engaged in activism. That gives me a lot of hope for this generation. But what it means is that this work cannot be brushed under the carpet if we're to have workforces that are fit for today and fit for the future.
And I think you make a really good point. You need to know the distinction between political and politicized, because I think that's what we're seeing playing out in D&I. It's taking a small narrative and making it into something that it is not. As we've all said, it is fundamentally about fairness and bringing everybody to the conversation. And who would not want to do that? So many organizations rely on innovation, globalization for growth. You simply can't do that without inclusion and diversity work.
I think it's also that piece of what ultimately is the problem you're trying to solve. And if it's fairness, if it's more opportunities, is it growth? Is it having more diverse thought in the business? It's that view of focusing on that piece. I also really listening to what you said. I don't know how many organizations would do it, but that accountability piece is huge. And it's ultimately, if you know that strategically from a business perspective, if you're looking at things like your customer base and the products you build or the things that you do as an organization fundamentally and who your audience is, you also need to be thinking about whoever you're designing or delivering for. What does that ultimately mean for the workforce that you need to bring in that's representative of that?
I think this is so interesting because what I've observed in my clients is those predominantly white, straight male leaders who've maybe been on the fence, a little bit quiet when it comes to DEI. They're showing up now. They're scratching at the door going, oh yeah, I've now realized innovation, creativity, whether it's a service industry, how we are showing up and how the business performance will be impacted if we don't have that diverse talent around the table. And I'm thinking, so you have been listening. You have been listening all these years. Where were you? But it's okay. They're showing up now. Let's work together.
Better late than never.
Exactly.
And some organisations, because of everything that's going on at the moment, we're seeing some organisations starting to rebrand their DEI efforts under new terms like belonging or inclusive leadership to avoid getting caught up in the controversy. Do you guys think that's a smart move, or is it just diluting the work?
I think it depends where you are on the journey. So we're fortunate, we're like 5-6 years in. So I think for us, these sort of new concepts make more sense. I think if you were starting today, you might just run the risk of you dilute it into something that's a bit, I don't know, ambiguous. Culture is everything. How do you really define what you're trying to achieve? So I think just purely from my experience, the benefit of just being clear at the start. And the things you do at the start of the D&I journey, they're not the things you want to be doing 3, 4, 5 years into the journey. You want to set that sort of example, that foundation, accountability, know your data, upskill managers, create awareness. You don't do that in the same way. And like anything, it just evolves. And I think an evolution into culture and belonging, and I always see belonging as like the utopia of the work anyway, is absolutely fine. I think it's just got to reflect where you are at that given time, what's the work you're really trying to do. And then the other thing for me is very much about, I think I'd rather just accept if it's a detraction, if certain words don't bring the broadest audience, which is always my goal. How do we get everybody to this conversation? Because we know if you own the stat around if women only work on gender-based inclusion, it's 30% effective. When men and women work together, it's 94% effective. We know that the real sustainable work happens when everybody feels accountable and everybody plays a role. We might play different roles, but everybody's part of the solution. We care about the things that we've shaped. We don't care about the things that have been done to us. And so I think it's a judgment call for people. But if that word or some of these wordings are just not going to bring the broadest audience, then they might be things people might want to reframe or reconsider, because everybody needs to feel part of this. Otherwise, you don't really get the traction that you need.
Yeah. Thank you, Jo. And ultimately what we're trying to create is that outcome of everyone feeling that they belong.
Wait, sorry, Kirsten, just to add to some of what Jo said, I think a huge piece of what I tend to see missing in some organizations is a values system. but also the people lens on the business strategy. And I think in the absence of those two, it's very hard for people to see where they show up and know how to show up. And I think those are quite critical when you're trying to build the right culture together for everyone to benefit.
I think that's a really good point. The values should determine how we behave and show up, right?
Yeah,
and when they're not linked through, then or they're not part of an inclusive culture, they're seen as separate. Really, this is a finely balanced ecosystem that we're creating. So I think that's an excellent point.
Good opportunity to go back and really revisit those. There's so many organisations that we visit and their values are up on the big wall, their top 5 values, but if you were to walk down the corridor and ask colleagues what they are, they wouldn't know off the top of their head. So yeah, a bit of work on that at the moment would really help support some of this work that we're all trying to do as well around DEIB. And for those that are saying that DEI is no longer needed, we've achieved the targets already, or that it gives some groups an unfair advantage, what would you say to that?
I think it goes back to the point that Joe made earlier, right? Every organization's on a different journey in terms of where they are, right? So for some organizations, they have met their targets and they set them. And I think there's an element of the reason we set targets is because you measure what you don't do, what you don't measure almost, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think there was a need for it because it drove accountability. I was on the FTSE Leader Review was launched last week, which is what drives the targets around female leadership across UK or FTSE listed organizations. And they were saying that for as long as they've been around, they've definitely made systemic change across the board levels from a female perspective. But if you look at the leadership levels, there's still so much work to be done. And you just think if mechanisms like that weren't there, would that drive the action? And interestingly enough, that's the number one thing that most organizations are stepping away from as a result of what's happening in the US political environment, because ultimately, and I can definitely see a case for it, is that those diverse targets lead for a certain type of behavior and or drive the nuance or the view of the fact that there are certain demographics that are being targeted and or favorited, I guess, in terms of roles. And it's just a really interesting one to say, because I don't know, I think there's an element of it, but equally, I always bring up the example that in my household, and Kirsten, you'll know this, like I tick a lot of different boxes: female, ethnic minority, foreigner, mom, lots of those boxes. My husband is a white middle-class male. And actually for the last X number of years, I've seen him be put aside for jobs because of the fact that he didn't hit a target. And so you can argue the case for both sides, because you're like, actually, that's not the reason. I don't want a role or to be given opportunity because I hit a number. I want to be given it because actually I'm really capable. And I just want that equal opportunity to have a seat at the table to be considered versus being chosen because of all the boxes that I tick for an organization. So it's just a really interesting dichotomy to be in around that.
Yeah, I agree. I think targets, it depends how you use them. It really does. To all the points that you're making, I tend to find data is a great influencer, and lots of CEOs like data, right? Because the majority of CEOs come from a finance, economics background. So data really does help you make your case and show gaps and impact that you can have. But also, if you use data in your decision making, it tends to be a lot fairer as well. There's lots of research that shows data-based decisions tend to be fairer. And of course, targets create accountability. Now, it really depends. Do you set a target for vanity, to show some level of commitment? Do you set a target to achieve it? Or do you set a target probably not to achieve it, but to drive accountability and change? So I think those are the ways you've got to find comfort around targets. And I think it does also fall into the trap that reality is every single person in the world is different, but we measure diversity through certain demographics. Now, I think representation is the outcome. It demonstrates you're fair and inclusive. But I think where it goes wrong is it's seen as, let's do the same things, but let's try and change the outcome. And I think anybody who is perceived to be hired is because they are diverse. I just really hate talking about diverse and the non-diverse because it just doesn't work. But Anyway, it's been shown it's actually it creates a negative experience in the organization. So I do think that some of the critics of D&I take the wrong interpretation of how you use numbers, how you close representation gaps, because you close them through doing the right things, knowing the challenges, creating equity, creating a culture for everybody to succeed. And this myth that people get hired just because, certainly not something we do, but I always say you'll never hire the best person for the job if they don't apply. How do you know you hired the best person for firstly, actually, I don't even think there is the best person for the job, because there are just people who can do the job. Somebody could do my job very differently, equally, probably better than me. I don't necessarily think I'm even the best person to do my job, but I'll do it, and you'll get my version of it. And I think that some of this rhetoric is just sidelined or distracted from what we're really here to achieve.
Yeah.
I think you make such a great point, because ultimately the one thing that it does allow, and I can see the comments coming up around data being so important, is it's driving more of that piece around like demographic data collection, for example, and being able to take some of that data and layer it against things like not looking at it in a silo, but layering it around things like your attrition rates, your people experience, and trying to understand what it looks and feels like for your employee base, depending on where they come from or what and how they describe themselves from all those different permutations that you can get. But that data piece is huge, because again, to Joe's point, you can't have a conversation with, I would argue, any exec or any leader without being able to have the data to back up what it is you're trying to drive across the organization from that standpoint.
Thank you. Some great insights there. Sunaina, you're nodding your head. Is there anything you would like to add?
Sunaina being Sunaina. So yeah, I agree. And I think there's some really powerful points that have been made by Arthi and Joe. But I keep coming back internally to, that's great. Hire the right people who are capable of doing the job well. Yes, we are all diverse, but who's still going to be there in a year's time if your culture isn't right? In 12 months, in 24 months time. So that's what I keep coming back to. I think it goes hand in hand. Yes, this work is very important. The data that we need to mine and the sort of hiring practices, even development and progression practices, but also you need to focus on the culture.
Absolutely. And I think we all have different things, right? We all need different things. We've done work around our talent programs and they've got criticism, right? But I'm just like, it's not about giving everybody the same, right? We all learn differently. We all have different barriers. We don't see what other people see or even have to navigate. And sometimes that's a real privilege. You can't necessarily see people's home lives, their personal energy levels, if they have a non-visible disability. The networks that the rooms you can walk into and not be challenged that you've walked into that room, you just fit in, and the rooms that other people can't walk into or have conversations. So we've always got to be challenging ourselves. And there's the other thing I also like is, whilst I love data, everything is data, is another thing I've learned working in D&I, right? How people show up, the questions that they ask, particularly leadership, what they ask and what they don't say, how they show up, their energy, the questions they ask, the things that they challenge, that's actually data as well. So we've got to absorb all of those different perspectives.
And Joe, you perfectly illustrated, right, where people get muddled between equality and equity. Having a program or access to something where everyone can just get stuck in isn't the answer. You, again, need to meet people where they are. People communicate differently. They absorb information differently. They develop at different paces. With all our wonderful diversities, I'm neurospicy too, so I will absorb information and learning in a very different way to others around me. So equity is so important in how you design and deliver.
Absolutely. And I think we haven't touched on well-being, but the mental health impacts, the attacks on our well-being, masking, navigating a complex world, an inaccessible world, it really pays on our energy levels and how we show up, and even how our brains function and our cognitive thinking.
I think that speaks to the volume around the intersectionality, right? Like, it's not about looking at DEI in a lens or whatever you want to call it, but actually understanding the impacts that it has to things like your talent and development and how they're growing, your well-being, the overall as a business, what you're trying to achieve. It's understanding that it's not just like the layers that we see in someone's demographic profile or how they define themselves. it's that much that you have to look at it from a business standpoint. You can't just look at it in a silo as one piece of the pie. It's connecting it. We talked about the values. It's connecting it to everything that you're doing.
Can we just move on to talk a little bit about belonging now? I know that's ultimately the outcome we're all striving for, where organisations feel that sense of belonging, feel that they're being heard, they're valued, etc. How can organisations really start thinking about embedding inclusive practices into their organisations, so that ultimately we can move more towards that idea of belonging?
I think one watch out for belonging is belonging can't work along the lines of things like ERGs are a good example, right? They have to be for everybody. And I've sometimes heard people critique belonging, saying, is that just creating connection within the certain area of that ERG? And it's not true belonging across the board. I think for me, around inclusion and belonging is shared values, shared behaviours, consistency, cultures of psychological safety, purpose and meaning in our work, right? In a world of AI, as humans, we will probably crave even more purpose in our work. What are we all really getting value? How are we shaping that within our lives as our lives in and out of work become more integrated? So I do see that sort of belonging really has to be through that cultural lens, and also through the sort of values and leadership and proposition and employee experience within the business.
And interesting that you reference to the ERGs, Jo. We've seen certainly with some smaller organisations that perhaps are at the beginning of this journey considering setting up ERGs. And a concern that comes up fairly regularly is that if we set up an ERG for this, or for LGBTQIA+, when we set up an ERG for something else, are we not then excluding other people within the organisation because we're not big enough to have the scale to set up an ERG for everything? What would you say to that, to organisations that are just at the start of that journey and wanting to be as inclusive as possible, but you have to start with kind of resources that you've got, and to be able to do that confidently without fear of perhaps upsetting other people within the organisation?
Welcome everybody else's views, but I guess from my perspective, I think if an ERG starts within that group and community, I think that's fine, because you've got to galvanise and build and bring more people along. So it really depends. We've got with our ERGs, they're all in different levels of maturity. We've just started a neurodiversity network. I imagine a lot of people within that are neurodiverse, but that's fine. Let's build it and then we'll come. We don't have to just hit an ERG right at the beginning saying, yeah, everybody's got to come to this, by the way, otherwise it's not going to be valuable. Because I think that takes time. I think what helps is having executive leaders. I think comms just reiterating, you can show up to these ERGs and learn and be an ally. We can all play different roles within that. I think empower ERGs to give you feedback. We've put in some sensory rooms in some of our big offices on the basis of feedback. So I think you've got to make it easy for them to be a voice and a representative group. And I think personally, you just keep chipping away, right? Our ERGs, 60% of attendees at our ERGs are women, and in our business, only 42% of our whole businesses are women. So we know we've got a disconnect. We know women are far more likely to engage and attend, but we just measure it, monitor it, and keep chipping away, because we want everybody to find the value in ERGs. But that does take time, in my view.
I'd say, from our standpoint, when I joined Ocado almost 4 years ago, we had 3 or 4 ERGs. Now we have 15, and we've left them very employee-led. So in some ways, while there were ones that were already set up when I started, everything that I would say has come out about as a result has been by someone putting up their hand saying that they don't see a group that represents them or one that they would want to kick off. And so from that perspective, what we have said, and it goes back to your earlier question, Kirsten, is that if people are feeling left out or not represented, I think the encouragement is create something that does allow that. So we've definitely not said no to anything. We've just been very employee led. And then the other piece to that is we really take the value of what our ERGs do and link them quite highly to what we do from a strategic perspective. So we bring them into the strategic conversations, what we're trying to do from an overall people and DE&I perspective, from a business standpoint, and give them that accountability to really make a stance and make a change.
I think one thing I would just add, because now is the time more than ever, I am also very conscious people who lead ERGs tend to come from less represented backgrounds, and there's always the trap that you are asking the people who experience the culture less positively, possibly that's societal as well. You are giving extra jobs to people who already have like lots of jobs, right? Because they have to navigate inaccessible worlds, they potentially have to deal with bias, microaggressions. And then we said, could you also educate everybody else in this? I do think you have to keep acknowledging that it's hard, because I think, to Artie's point, you have to get going somehow, right? And sadly, it does take the people who say, actually, you know what, I'm going to make a difference here because I do not want this experience to be the next generation's experience. But I think as much as you can alleviate the responsibility on ERGs to educate everybody and be respectful of that, and also say your lived experiences are not here as educational tools for everybody else. Share if you wish, and that's amazing, but don't feel the burden to use your own lived experience for the benefit of others.
Yeah, that's some really great advice there from two organisations that are building up their ERG networks. And you just touched on a little bit about lived experience there, Joe. Listening, a question for you. What role do you feel that personal stories can play in challenging assumptions around belonging and really creating that space for different, diverse voices to be heard?
So I think storytelling is really powerful. Those who know me know I like to talk and I'll tell lots of stories, but I think it's such a powerful way of learning about one another, of diffusing barriers, of just removing stereotypes and building inclusion. I think when you tell your story, two things happen. There'll be someone in the room or in the virtual space who will resonate. It will be a moment of comfort where they're like, oh yes, I understand, that's me too. So there's comfort. And the other thing is there will be education, people who realize maybe I got it wrong, maybe I need to do better. So I think it's a real sort of human connection catalyst to be able to use storytelling to build inclusive cultures, but you need to know how to storytell. And I think in a lot of the work that we do, even with the ERGs, the expectation is there, but do we set people up for success and just nurture them a little bit to know how to show up? That even extends to our sponsors. Sponsors need to understand what is expected of them. It is not just come to an iconic moment, have a LinkedIn post. There is so much more. What doors can they open? What access can they give the ERGs? So I think storytelling is powerful when done right. And also, I think there tends to be a weight or an expectation on leaders to show up and role model and storytell. And there are two words that I believe give leaders anxiety: vulnerability and authenticity. And they're like, oh my gosh, how much of myself do I have to put out there? And I always tell leaders that I work with, imagine you've got two dials. One's authenticity, one's vulnerability. Turn them up and turn them down when you feel safe, when you feel comfortable, and when you feel what you need to share is appropriate for that moment. It is not about putting all of yourself out there, because leaders need safety too. Mm-hmm. And just going back a second to the ERGs, I think we need to be really mindful. I love everything that was said, but a couple of things came to mind was the size of your organization. Some organizations are small but mighty. You may not be able to have multiple ERGs. So maybe an inclusion council, a belonging committee, something like that, where there is diverse representation, but that's one unit as opposed to dividing off. And then the weight of the work lands on the same 2 or 3 people all the time, doesn't it? I also think creating an ERG around mental health support, so perhaps mental health first aiders, time to talk space, because that can sometimes fill the void if someone doesn't see themselves in a particular ERG that's been set up, but does want some comfort. And of course, that mental health support ERG should be diverse in the representation of who is working in that. And I completely agree with Arti. It's employee-led all the way. They have to take ownership. They have to understand, again, what success looks like, what they're showing up for, but they have to own that moment. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
No, it's really great practical nuggets in there as well. really like the idea of an inclusion council as well. I just want to, there's a question that just builds on what we've already been talking about in terms of leaders and storytelling. A question from John Taylor Cummings. For leaders who are already leveraging storytelling to foster belonging, what are the next level strategies that you're perhaps seeing in your organisations to ensure that these narratives are driving systemic change rather than remaining isolated moments of inspiration?
I have a response to that. I think leaders who are showing up, they need to dig deeper into peer level conversations and accountability, because it's very often the same 2 or 3 leaders that keep showing up for this work. And I think they need to put their pressure on their peer group, because we need everybody, every leader at the table talking about this now more than ever.
I agree with that. I think the only other thing I'd add to is consistency. So it's not a moment in time. It's not, there's something like International Women's Day that comes up and someone tells a story, and then after that, they don't talk about it for another 12 months. I think it's that view of like actually consistency in how you're living and breathing it day to day.
But that comes down to DEI being woven through every aspect of the business, then, doesn't it? Yeah. So it can't just be something that sits within HR. It's got to be seen, as I said earlier, in your business strategy, and for people to know how the organization sees them and what their role is in the bigger picture.
And I was just going to add, I think storytelling and turning up as a leader to advocate is great. Listening's pretty good too. So sometimes I would like people to listen more rather than feel the need to speak. And then I also think you've got to slightly read the room and know your audience, right? So if you talk about being authentic, right, that is a spectrum of options for people. Turning up as your authentic self might be easy for some. It may never be an option for others. So just be sensitive to how some of the terminology comes across. Or being vulnerable, it's hard for us all to do, but for some, being vulnerable is much easier, right? Because the consequences of which are much less. And I'm actually just a fan of stories from anybody, right? Our most impactful events have actually just been colleagues just sharing their stories, right? Because our empathy levels are so much greater when we learn of the experiences of somebody sat next to us, or somebody we have coffee with, or we see in the office, and we hear their story. We care so much more than an expert coming in and sharing their stories. I truly believe just the power of listening and hearing everybody's stories within, because we've all got a story and we all want to be heard. Hearing that can just be so much more impactful.
And I think those, certainly from our experience at Camwell, the sessions that we run where it's all about hearing from your colleagues, their personal stories, they always get a much bigger attendance rate than something specific subject matter. So yeah, absolutely, really creating that safe space for people to have those conversations. But it can be daunting, can't it? As you said very early on, leaders are expected to not only listen, but they're expected to storytell, to be authentic, to be vulnerable. Are your organisations providing training, equipping leaders with kind of these new skills to lead in the 21st century?
I actually work with leaders on a one-to-one basis. So whether I'm doing it with individuals or going into an organization, I think the one-to-one space is something they're very rarely afforded when it comes to DEI, so that they can learn, grow, and even stumble. They have questions, they have that fear of what if I get it wrong? What if I don't use the right terminology, especially when it comes to neurodiversity or LGBTQ+. I think the reason a lot of leaders don't step forward and shy away from this work is because they haven't had the safe space to be able to explore and build that confidence. And they don't have the DEI capabilities to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to be authentic, to know how much of their story holds power to the people that they're speaking to be able to influence their peers. So I think supporting leaders in judgment-free environments that lend them the same safety that we want to award our people is really important in building up the right capabilities to lead this work.
So finding a way for DEI to be integrated into leadership development.
Completely.
And what is above and beyond what we've spoken about already in terms of true inclusive leadership? What does that look like to you or feel like to you?
So one of my favourite questions to ask leaders, because of course we have different opinions, is how has leadership changed in the last 10 years? And actually, it's surprisingly similar what they'll say. They'll talk about enabling teams to navigating complexity, managing in matrix style organizations, global organizations. Nobody talks about getting things done through structure, power, hierarchy anymore. Everybody sort of talks about how you have to enable people, how you have to create psychological safety, how you have to lead inclusively, and almost unbossing is another term I sometimes hear. So I actually think there's a lot more consistency around what leadership is now and how leaders think about leadership compared to how traditionally, I think if you look back to the 70s and 80s, so much was done through hierarchy, layers, routine was far more common in jobs. Now we are just figuring out navigating for ourselves and managing in a very non-hierarchical, global, hybrid way by our side, however the world's gonna use that. So I actually think a lot of leaders do see that, and I think that's where we get in as D&I professionals and say we're here to help guide that journey.
Thank you, Jo. What kind of metrics or frameworks are out there, or that you're using yourself perhaps, that can be used to measure things like belonging that go beyond employee surveys? Anything that you're doing in your organisations, or anything that you've seen that you think is really smart?
We do a lot of pairing from a data perspective. I wish I could take all the credit, but our people analytics team is absolutely phenomenal. We do a lot of work around the linkage of the data with other elements. So things like our engagement survey tool and or other data pieces that we might be collecting. And we've done things like for inclusion, we have an index, for example, that we're using this year that measures one of our biggest strategic goals around inclusion for our business. It takes a few metrics into account, but it's looking at the basis of what does inclusivity actually mean for us and how do we want to measure success. I think the metrics, there could be lots of frameworks that organizations could use, but I think ultimately an organization has to be really crystal clear on the challenge that they're trying to solve for and what their exact circumstance looks like. It's like one of those things where everyone set gender targets. So if someone said it, I should set it, but is setting a gender target the right thing for your organization or not? I think it's ultimately understanding what the challenge is in your business, and therefore then what are the best measurements or metrics that are going to be used to help you solve for that problem or keep a pulse on what's happening with that.
Thanks, Artie.
I would just add to that. Oh, sorry, Jo. Just very quickly, one of the key data points I think we often miss is the exit survey. And or not even survey, it should be a conversation because it's such an emotive time. And I know organizations may not have the resources to have a conversation with everyone as they exit, but that is valuable insight into perhaps what didn't go right and where you can start building in effective interventions.
Absolutely. I think we're still trying to figure out how you measure belonging. So that was very happy to hear two answers before me. But I think potentially we're going to look at how do people experience our culture, of which I agree attrition is a really good measure around that, particularly our 2-year attrition. I think is something we'll look a lot more at, because I think if you really belong, you've got to start feeling that within the first 1 to 2 years of employment. So if your attrition is much higher in the first 2 years, that's one metric. Then start looking at different demographics and see if you're noticing any difference around the 2-year retention of colleagues. I also quite like engagement data around people attending ERGs, doing D&I training, wellbeing initiatives, because to me that just indicates, do you consume or get active in our culture? And if you're truly getting active and involved in our culture, I think you should have a deeper sense of connection and belonging to that business.
Can I also add, so Gen Z, we know, are very vocal, right? In a one-to-one, in a team setting or on TikTok, they will tell you how they feel. So earlier we talked about listening, and I think leaders also have a responsibility to not just listen, but to then act on what they're hearing. And I think sometimes that's where organizations fall short. So Gen Z will tell you whether they feel that they belong or where there's a problem. How we listen and how much we act on, I think, is real fuel to build that culture of belonging.
I agree. I think particularly when you look at leadership, of course, there's going to be a link, right? You are more senior when you are older generally, and you have a certain level of experience. But we're fastly seeing businesses where leadership is Gen X and the new generation is Gen Z, and they have quite different views around resilience, speaking out, getting on with it, attitude. But the social contract's very different. This is where I argue, if you're Gen X, you probably bought your first property in your 20s. If you're Gen Z, 40s, maybe never. Aspiration has completely changed around that because of what kind of, and I think it is sad in many respects that perhaps people don't get the same social contract that perhaps other leaders have experienced before.
So much fantastic insight today, and I know we're going to be running out of time soon, so I'd just like to ask you all if you could give organisations one piece of advice to ensure that DEI remains a priority in the years ahead. What would that be?
I think I'm happy to start. I think for me, it's the link to the strategic focus of the business. I think ultimately DE&I, for it to be a success, like any other topic area you want to look at in your business, whether it's well-being, sustainability, or so forth, there has to ultimately be a strategic imperative and an ultimate impact on the organization's success. And I think the lack of connection with that can sometimes mean that programs fall short and or don't make it to where they need to be. So for me, that would be the biggest piece.
A bit like well-being, Artie, as well.
100%, yeah.
I'll add to that. So, of course, making it strategic, but I'm not just, this isn't a sales pitch or anything. Work with who you need to, but I think work with the right people. This is now the time to bring experts in, just like you would with any other business critical agenda. We haven't been doing that historically. We've been trying to figure it out. And even if you have an in-house DEI team, that's fine. Sometimes their capabilities need to be enhanced. Sometimes having an external perspective helps them show up differently. So I think be open to working with the right people. Historically, DEI has been very passion-led, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it will get you only to a certain point. So now if you really want to turn up the dial and we really want to make those systemic changes, consider working with experts, even within your business, but bring that more strategic lens to this work.
Thank you, Sunena.
Yeah, trying to add to what's already been brilliantly said, but I think you just have to find your why. Are you committed to this? And I think where we've seen some companies scale back, I think the optics are bad, and I think it raises questions about their leadership commitment to this work and why was that the choice that they took. So I do think leaders have to find their why and their own level of commitment.
Thank you. It's such a fascinating topic of conversation. I feel like we could just sit here all morning and chew the fat on this. And I know it's some great comments. I think it's really added some value, some expansion to people's thoughts on the agenda and where it's going. And there's been some great practical nuggets as well for organisations to take away. I think more than anything, this conversation's just reinforced how critical it is to keep pushing forward for progress, even in the face of resistance. It's not just about policies and programs, but we've talked about values, we've talked about leadership, and really the kind of organisations that we want to create. And it is a challenging time for sure, budget cuts, political pushback, etc. But I think you guys have discussed really clearly the opportunity as well, whether that's the role of leadership, the power of data, the ways that we can start to embed DEI into our culture rather than just passing initiatives. So I'd just like to thank you all for your fantastic insights today. Thank you to our audience for joining us for this conversation. DEI work has never been easy. And in today's climate, it feels like it needs a huge amount more of courage, resilience, and commitment. But it's not going to go away, and neither should our efforts. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined in. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, we will look to do a post that summarises this. There should be a recording as well. But yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your days.
Okay.